This is part 4 of my Kyosho Lazer ZXS Evolution restoration video series. So even though it looks like I haven't done a whole lot of new stuff since the last video, I gotten a few things done. I also developed a new understanding. So as far as what's been done since the last video, I think it's the steering rack and the front and rear shock towers, and that's basically it, and I think the upper deck as well. So with the steering rack, so I'll start there. Interestingly, I'm not sure if it's because of this particular type of belt or not, but I did find that when I put the steering rack back on, the let me if I just flip this over. This guy right here that screws up through the bottom plate and into the belt crank, that just barely touches the belt teeth here on the bottom portion of the belt. So all I did to get some clearance there was to put a 1mm spacer or washer between this little nut thing and the chassis. This isn't really a nut, it's actually a nut end with a long shaft that goes up that this whole steering rack slots into, and there's one on either side. So just 1 extra millimeter there, and this moves much more freely. It doesn't get caught on the belt. Okay, and that 1mm, technically speaking, that will move this up a bit, so it will change how much bump steer you have on the car for your nominal setting. So just to cancel this out, when I put the steering knuckles together, I'll just have to add a 1mm spacer there, just to basically bring everything up by a millimeter, so that way the bump steer is unchanged. Okay, so that's point number 1. Point number 2, I had mentioned that I was using a particular belt length in the previous video. Let me just see if I can get the number on this one. Okay, so I was using a S3M 546 originally, and what I found was when I put everything in, tightened down the front, the upper gearbox, put on the upper deck and tighten that down, the upper deck kind of stretches, flexes the chassis back a little bit and really sets everything in place. That belt was really tight. So I put on a 549. So basically I added 1 tooth, so the belt's a little bit longer, and that certainly helps. It's still a little bit on the tight side, but it's not horrible. I mean, it's hard for me to really spin this and hold it with one hand, because I'm holding my phone with the other hand, but it's not bad. I think what I want to try is replacing this with, instead of a 549, a 552. That would be the next step up. That would be a bit looser, and I could put in, a roller bearing somewhere, here, for example, to pick up the rest of the slack. So something greater than a 549 is probably ideal, especially if you want some adjustability in the belt tension here. The rear belt, I did not change that, and that seems to spin relatively freely, because the belt teeth that I chose for that, it's slightly on the loose side. And if I take 1 tooth out to tighten it all up, it's way too tight. So that one's okay. It's really this front belt. So I'd probably recommend using a 552 for the front belt. Other things to point out, and by the way, I did order a set of those from Polybelt, plus a whole other assortment of belt lengths that just happen to not be in stock. So it'll be a few weeks before those come in. By the way, replacing this belt, major pain in the ass, because what essentially you have to do, the front part of it is easy. You just take out these 2 screws here, these 2 screws here, the front lifts up, you take the diff out, you get the belt out of the front side. Okay, no problem. Then you got to take, the upper deck off, which is the same thing in any of the other Lazers, because the belt kind of goes between, or the deck kind of goes between the upper and lower portions of the belt. Fine. Getting the belt out of this side is where it gets difficult, because you have to remove it from this half of the gearbox. So you got to take this plate off, and then you have to take this plate off, which means taking the rear tower off. You take this off, and then I think then you can get to basically pulling the belt off from this direction. But there's a lot of surgery there, and it's actually easier to replace. I think it's, if I remember correctly, might be easier to replace this center belt on the normal Lazer just because of the way the gearbox is assembled, but I have to double check that. Either way, a lot of surgery to do that, so that's kind of a pain. What I do like though is, and I kind of overlooked this in the previous video, is that getting to the front diff is a lot easier in the ZXS and ZXS Evolution than in the other Lazers. The reason for that is because the upper half of the gearbox comes up like this. So you can just take that diff and lift it up and take it out. On the Lazer ZXR, the ZXR-R, it's completely different. Basically, instead of an upper and lower half, it's a front and rear half. So you can take the front half off, and that's pretty easy to do. But then to get that diff out, because the belt is supposed to have a certain amount of tension, you can't just pull the diff out. You have to unseat the rear half of the gearbox and kind of push that back, maybe even take the upper deck off to give you room to sort of push everything back, to give you enough slack in the belt to pull that front diff pulley out. So it's more of a pain to get to the front diff in the previous model Lazers. Okay, so the ZXS really makes an improvement there. The only problem is, because of the way this is assembled, it's assembled in 4 pieces, so it's a more complex assembly. But at the end of the day, it's just 4 screws, just pops out, you get the diff out. And then for the rear diff, this is arguably more difficult to get to, because on the old Lazer, the left half of the gearbox, you have like an upper and lower portion. All you got to do is just remove that lower portion out, and then you can just pull the rear diff pulley straight out this way. Here, if you want to pull this diff out, essentially you take these 2 screws out, you take these 2 screws off, okay? So basically, and then you do 1, 2, 3, 4. And what that's essentially allowing you to do is just to take the whole gearbox assembly and lift it up. And you're lifting the top half up away from the bottom half. And then from there, you can just pull the diff pulley out. So not too bad. Still more screws than in the older model Lazers, and a bit more operation, but not too bad. So let's see. What else do I have going on here? Well, okay, you can see I got the rear tower on. I got the rear. I had to get a new rear sway bar because the one that came with it was all scratched up. It's still perfectly functional, but it's all scratched up. All right, so next thing we're going to work on here is the suspension arms, caster blocks, steering blocks, all that stuff. Then the shocks, and that's more or less it. So, getting the drivetrain together for the gearboxes is the worst part of this, and it really sucks. But once you get through that, the rest of the build is just like a normal Lazer, really. So yeah, that's it for now, and thanks for watching.